Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Now let us begin the session on the UN Summit of the Future, whose future and who shapes it. Later, the discussion will be moderated by Abena Soreno Yanquera, a media personality and menstrual health advocate. But we will first open the session by having a special conversation featuring Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the president of UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. And for this, we invite the founder and chairman of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Dr. Dino Patijalal, to host the special conversation. Dr. Dino, you may have the floor.
Thank you, Jenny. And I'm pleased to welcome all the speakers for this important discussion on the UN Summit of the Future. And I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, who will have discussion with me in the next 28 minutes or so. And Professor Jeffrey Sachs is president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and he's also the director of Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. From 2001 till 2018, Professor Sachs served as special advisor to UN Secretary Generals Kofi Annan, and then Ban Ki-moon, and then Antonio Guterres. He was also the director of Earth Institute at Columbia University from 2002 and 2016. And I remember when I served as foreign policy advisor to President Yudhoyono, we had very good relations, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs always gave good advice to us. So it's nice to see you again, Professor.
Thank you.
And throughout the day, a recurrent theme was that the multilateral system is under duress, and many question the multilateralism's capacity to resolve today's problems. In fact, the conflicts in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine and in Gaza have challenged the faith and confidence in multilateralism. And obviously the UN is at the center of multilateralism. And on the 22nd and 23rd of this month, there will be a UN Summit of the Future. So I guess my first question to you is, what is the significance of the UN Summit of the Future, and what is the utility or futility of this exercise? Yeah. And please give us your take on this. Yeah.
First, thank you. Thanks for this wonderful forum, and wonderful to see you. Well, the idea is to make the United Nations function more effectively. This is really the agenda of the Summit of the Future, to make multilateralism work. We should understand multilateralism is always fragile. It's always fragile because we don't have strong global institutions. We have nation states. We're organized by nation states. The United Nations is not a global government. It is a meeting place of 193 nation states. Moreover, the nation states are not all equal in their power, their size, their role in the international system. There are great powers that have tremendous military, nuclear, and other capabilities that dominate war and peace issues, and that very often, especially my own country, the United States, that ignore the United Nations. So we have great powers, including the United States, Russia, China, India. I would say at least as four of the most powerful nations in the world. And the UN system sits alongside a very different system, which is a great power politics system. The UN by itself has no financial resources other than what it garners from the nations. It has no military, of course, other than what comes through UN peacekeeping operations. It has no enforcement mechanisms. So The treaties that are under the UN framework are generally not enforceable other than through the decisions of the signatories to enforce them. We are at a time of obviously very fraught great power confrontation, but of a particular kind, in my opinion, and that is the U.S. is trying to maintain a delusional global hegemony, because I know in my country, the security leaders think the U.S. Still calls the shots in the world, if I could put it that way. But obviously Russia doesn't agree, China doesn't agree, and so forth. So we are in a confrontation that I think comes from a confrontation of mindsets, where the mindset of the US security state is to dominate, the mindset of Russia is to resist, the mindset of China is to say, are you kidding? This is not the world we want. And alongside that are global crises like climate change, poverty, environmental disruptions, food insecurity, major crises. And they need cooperation of the major powers, not confrontation. But instead we have a war between Russia and the United States in Ukraine. And be sure, this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between the United States and Russia. It happens to be taking place in Ukraine. The United States wants to put military bases in Ukraine. Russia says no. That's what this war is about. It's a war of great powers. I think the U.S. is completely wrong in this, and that it provoked this war. But be it that as it may, we have a hot war. And then we have a potential war in East Asia over Taiwan, which again, to my mind, is not an issue for war. But there's a lot of talk about war right now and a lot of tensions. So my own feeling, just to come to your point, I think the Secretary General called for this meeting. I can't speak for him, I'm interpreting. He called for this meeting because he knows the UN has to work more effectively. He is completely aware of the great power politics that takes place outside of the UN, and he wants to bring the true global politics, finance, law inside a true multilateral system. Well, that's my view. This is what we really need. My effort every day in the United States is to say to my own government, the United States government, stop your delusions of hegemony and join a true multilateral system. I think this can happen eventually. I hope it happens peacefully and quickly. But this, to me, is part of the drama. If we put aside the great power politics and ask simply about the functioning of multilateralism, then we need real reform to strengthen the UN. For example, to be able to provide real finance to challenges like climate change in poor countries or lower middle income countries that don't have access to quality finance. We need global taxes, in my view, that are collected globally, not by nation states, but by the UN itself on international shipping, international aviation, global financial transactions, and so forth, that are not given by permission of the United States each year, but are part of a global tax system to address global public goods. So that would greatly strengthen matters. We need reform of the UN institutions in a number of ways so that they're more representative, more powerful. The veto of individual powers of the P5 is diminished by an override of vetoes by supermajorities or other approaches. So these are the topics that are, in my view, at the core of the Summit of the Future.
At the very least, Professor, what do you need to see achieved at the UN Summit of the Future in order to call it a success?
We need, and we won't get more than this, there will be a statement coming out of it, a global pact for the future, but we will not settle complex institutional issues in a 2-day meeting, September 22, 23. But we need a commitment to do so and a roadmap to do so. Just to give you an example, the issue number one, or bucket number one, literally, the first bucket of issues for the Summit of the Future is sustainable development. It's achieving sustainable development. And within that context, finance for sustainable development is understood to be the main factor that is lagging right now. Developing countries cannot get access to the finance they need for the investments that they need, whether it's for climate or ecosystems or education for all or the other objectives of the 17 SDGs. So I expect, I hope at the Summit of the Future, there will be a strong statement that the global financial architecture needs fundamental reform to ensure access, especially of the poorest countries, but of all countries, to the finance that is needed on the quality of terms that is needed. Long-term, low interest rate, at least comparable to what the rich countries get. Now, that will not be analytically or substantively settled in September, but there will be a Finance for Development Summit in 2025, June 30 to July 3 in Madrid. By then, there ought to be specifics. What's going to happen to the regional development banks? What's going to happen to the credit rating agencies? What's going to happen to sustainability analysis carried out by the Bretton Woods institutions? What are the terms that are going to be available to low-income countries? We have time for that by next late June, early July. And what I would like the Summit of the Future to do is to make clear the path is from this commitment to the outcomes next Finance for Development to get this done.
The 2024 Sustainable Development Report revealed that only 16% of SDGs are on track to be achieved by 2030. And, if you go to Southeast Asia, you go to South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, SDGs are big, right? In fact, we have a doctrine, ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, where one of the 4 main priorities is achieving SDGs. But there's talk in the Global South that the West, including the United States, has really little interest in SDGs, as reflected in the rhetorics of policy statements of its leaders, rarely mentioning about SDGs. Is that right? Is that accurate or inaccurate? Yeah.
It's not only accurate, it's shockingly so in the following sense. Every country is supposed to put forward its SDG plans to the high-level political forum. These, of course, are called the Voluntary National Reviews, or VNRs. Of the 193 UN member states, 188 have presented VNRs, some countries several times. 5 countries have not presented VNRs. Those are Haiti, Myanmar, South Sudan, Yemen, and, drumroll, the United States of America. So the US has never presented a voluntary national review, because if I were to ask a US senior official, well, what is the SDG plan? They would say, what's SDG? They don't know. There's no attention in my country at the national level to this. But that's the mindset of the US, unilateral, arrogant, hubristic, not understanding what's going on in the rest of the world, and engaged in war. Okay, it's very important for everyone to understand, though, this is not a reason for neglecting the SDGs or being cynical about the SDGs. This is an occasion for being a little sad about the United States of America, that's for sure, which has really dropped the ball. First of all, for its own citizens, by the way, because we have so many problems internally. But it's not a reason for the rest of the world to be cynical. It is, in my view, partly an explanation why the SDGs are way behind, because one country that's very important in this system doesn't even know about them, doesn't care about them, doesn't focus on them, doesn't provide policies around them, doesn't do it at home. But it's also a reason to say, look, the rest of the world, we're on the right track, because sustainable development, it's not a nice thing, it's not a slogan, it's not a photo op, it's actually vital to combine economic development with social justice, with environmental sustainability, with peace and cooperation. Now, we want to get the US on board. I don't know how many years it's going to take. I keep trying. We'll keep trying. But we're at least at 188 out of 193. I travel the world nonstop, as you know, and wherever I go, governments are committed to the SDGs. They don't have the finance they need. They watch the sanctions regimes, the wars, the priorities of the US dominate, but they are committed to the SDGs. So I want the SDGs to work because they're urgent, not just because we said so, but because they're urgent. And I think that we need to use the Summit of the Future and other forums. The BRICS, for example, extremely important. All of the BRICS committed to the SDGs. We need to use the COP processes in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, in the Convention to Combat Desertification, to promote the SDGs. We really need finance for development to work. We need to fix the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks. My message is, don't give up hope, because actually there is so much more consensus on these points than disagreement. It's annoying to me, to put it mildly, that the US is not part of this, but the US is 4.1% of the world population. We've got 95.9% of the world population that we can deal with. And I think eventually the United States will come around. You know, there's a famous saying of Winston Churchill, which is that the United States always does the right thing after it's tried everything else. And I think that this is sometimes a pretty accurate depiction.
Having said that, I think there's a thinking in a large part of the world. Look, if the United States is not ready, we move on anyways, right? And my question to you, in the efforts to revive North-South dialogue and cooperation, which has been going on, the efforts of which have been going on for decades, in such an effort today, is it more reasonable to count on the role of the middle powers of the North and the South? The Brazils, the Indonesias, Turkeys, and the North of Germany and Canada and so on, where cooperation seems to be easier done. So is that the way forward, to rely on these drivers in the North and South, the middle powers in North and South, as champions of North-South dialogue?
My feeling is, first, every region needs to get its act together as a region. So I'm a very big fan of ASEAN acting as a region, because ASEAN shares problems, it shares rivers, it shares ecosystems, it shares rainforests, it shares fisheries, it shares the Indian Ocean, it shares security issues, and so on. And I would like the regional focus. Second, and when it comes to Africa, I'm a very strong proponent of a very strong African Union, because the colonial powers left Africa as 55 independent countries. But if you view Africa as a unity, it's got 1.4 billion people, the same size as China, the same size as India, and I think the same growth prospects as well for very rapid growth in the decades ahead. So I would like to see each region work on long-term sustainable development strategies. ASEAN in 2050. Africa talks about 2063 because of the history of African unity and so forth. But long-term regional strategies, including investments in transport networks, fast rail, 5G, zero carbon power, and so on. Second, I'd like the regions to work together. By the way, in Asia, I would like Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea, and China not to be on opposite sides of a Cold War, but actually integrated together. Because if you put China, Korea, Japan constructively together, oh my God, the results of that for the three and for the rest of the world would be absolutely phenomenal. I'm a very big believer in integration between China and ASEAN, I have to say, because China is by far the world's largest industrial nation, twice the size of the United States in the industrial sector, very cutting edge on transport, power, digital, and it would be phenomenal to have a good integrated advanced 21st century green and digital network connecting China with ASEAN. I like RCEP, which is actually China, Japan, Korea, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand. I want to put aside the Cold War rhetoric and politics and actually have an integrated, peaceful region, because this would be completely phenomenal. Now, this raises the questions of the so-called North, which basically has three parts to it. There's the United States, there's Europe, and there are the US allies in East Asia. I've already spoken about the US allies in East Asia and the Pacific. I want them to be much less anti-China and much more regional cooperation. When it comes to the United States, we need a new mindset in the United States. Drop the idea of global hegemony, get on with the idea of global cooperation. It will come eventually, because that's the reality, but it's not there yet. When it comes to Europe, there's a huge confusion because Europe has two aspects. One aspect is the European Union. Great, I love it. The European Green Deal and all the rest. But the second aspect of Europe is NATO. And NATO is a US-dominated security system. Europe has this, it can't decide what it is. Is it a peaceful union of countries, or is it an appendage of the US hegemonic aspirations? Europe has gotten itself into a complete mess by supporting the war in Ukraine the way that it has. Instead of going for peace, it has said, we're going to expand NATO. And that is not going to happen, by the way. So when it comes to discussions with Europe, I'm not keen on Europe as being simply a piece of the US security system. I would like Europe to have its own independence. When it comes to economics, there is the prospect of good dialogue, say, between ASEAN and the EU over the future of sustainable development. That's possible, but not if you hear from the Europeans, you must abide by the sanctions against Russia, you must cut off trade, you must understand that this is anti-China. That would kill the dialogue. So I don't believe in a North-South dialogue, period, in this way anymore. The world is multipolar. It has moved on. But Europe needs to get clarity that it's on its best when it's on the peaceful mission of sustainable development, and it is on its worst when it is repeating US tropes that are anti-Russia and anti-China. And this, I think, is part of the drama right now of our global discussions.
Yeah, Professor Sachs, I totally agree with you that I would love to see China, Japan, and Korea, working better together. And I think even a bigger deal is US and China working together. Can you imagine the enormous powers of these two countries being the largest economies, their technology and their soft power and so on. And obviously this has not gone well if you see their relationship in terms of COVID-19, for example, and on climate change and so on. They have not worked well together. Can you explain to us as an American, and this is a question that many in the global South ask. Okay, we understand that U.S.-Russia relations is permanently damaged, but what about U.S.-China? Why can't these two guys find some kind of normalized relationship and maybe even strategic mutual accommodation and work together and show themselves as examples to the rest of the world? Because that's one of the big keys to having healthy multilateralism.
This is the great crucial question. First, let me say I do not believe that U.S.-Russia relations are permanently damaged. And I always like to quote President John F. Kennedy, who famously said there are no permanent enemies. He said, hostility today is a fact, but it is not a governing law. And this is really true. And he understood that. Even from the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, the next year, he reached an agreement with Nikita Khrushchev on the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty because he wanted peace. And so I don't want to say that anything is permanently damaged. I make the argument, I'm going to make it in a discussion with my friend John Mearsheimer at a conference in LA on Monday, Tuesday, that there is no reason at all for hostile relations between the US and China. China is not a threat at all to the United States, in my opinion. I don't think Russia's a threat to the United States. If we don't provoke, there's no threat. I think the great powers can live together peacefully, even without the sense of fear, if they don't provoke each other in their own neighborhoods. So I really don't want Russia or China setting up a military base in Mexico, but I tell the United States, just calm down. Don't set up military bases in Ukraine, and don't go to war over Taiwan. That's not your neighborhood, and you don't need to provoke other regions of the world. So that, to my mind, is the most important point. China is viewed as an enemy, though, by the US security state for one overwhelming reason. It's large and it's successful. That causes resentment and anxiety because in this US idea, I'm sorry to say it, they really believed in 1992, well, we're the sole superpower. We are the biggest colossus in history. We can do what we want. This is the so-called neoconservatives. They believed it. It's crazy. If you travel the world, it's crazy. No country can say to the rest of the world, we're the leader, we do what we want. But in Washington, where they don't travel, I don't even know if they have passports, they actually believe this thing. So this is, to my mind, the biggest mindset change that's needed in the US. There's high anxiety about China, to my mind, completely unjustified. And when I say, though, come on, China's not a threat at all, people look at me like I'm crazy. But I go to China several times a year with so many students, former students, friends, colleagues, and so on. And I just don't accept the US mindset that there are deep threat reasons. I also don't think China's a threat to its neighborhood. Let me be clear. China's actions in the South China Sea, to my mind, are not about who owns that particular island. They're about don't block our sea lanes. We need oil. We import food. We know that the US views these as choke points. We don't want the Straits of Malacca to be a choke point. We don't want the South China Sea to be dominated by US submarines. This is the real point. These are security issues. This isn't attempts to dominate. These are security issues. And if both powers would back off each other, things could calm down tremendously.
Yes, well, maybe one last question, and we only have 1 minute for you to answer this. But in the event that President Trump wins again in November, the theme "Make America Great Once Again" will be predominant, right? And my worry is that look, if America thinks that way under Trump presidency, many countries around the world will think the same. It's all about me too, right? And this is terrible for multilateralism, right? Because that's not what multilateralism is all about. It's all about us, right? Rather than it's all about me, right? So I don't know if you have any quick comments on
I
that.
do. If Trump wins, you should worry. If Harris wins, you should worry. I'm worried, period. Because the problem is not which political party in the United States or even which candidate. The party is a U.S. mindset that has gone from Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. All 5 of the last presidents have been on this unipolar idea. This is the thing that needs to change. And by the way, if the rest of the world is clear, calm, nice, but persistent, we want multilateralism, we want the UN, we don't want wars, we don't want great power clashes, we don't want to be part of your alliance, we don't want to be part of their alliance, we want to be independent, peaceful, and multilateral. This message is extremely important because it will get through.
Well, thank you. You always give candid answers and much food for thought, so I really appreciate it. And this is what the Global Town Hall about, an open and deep dive, honest, candid discussions by the grassroots, for the grassroots. So thank you very much
Phenomenal.
for your
Great to
time.
be with everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And
Bye-bye.
now, thank you so much. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Abina, the next moderator, who will